WTCM Newstalk 580, a little Elvis on a Monday. Ron Jolly in, along with Vic McCarty's here in place of Colleen Wares today. And we have a full studio, and the film that we're going to talk about will air tonight, and it's free. So as you listen and say you'd like to see this movie, be sure you go to the State Theater and reserve your tickets today for the 6 o'clock show tonight. It's called The Price of Peace. Joining us today, Jack Siegel is in from the International Affairs Forum, retired State Department diplomat for many years, been around the world, all the hot spots, and a Vietnam War vet. Thank you, sir.
You are so welcome. Thank you for having us.
To your left, another guy who's been here before, Air Force Major General, retired and former Thunderbird pilot Brian Bishop of Leelanau County. Sir, thanks for being in.
Having us here.
We have filmmakers in today who who made the film. That's why they call them the filmmakers here. We have on mic with us right now Elan Bentov. Elan, Elan or Elan?
Elan.
Elan, thank you very much for being. Where are you from? L.A. or
L.A.
In from L.A. And also with us today, Tom Skinner of Leelanau County is the producer of the movie, and the other co-filmmaker is Kip Perry, whom we'll hear from in a moment. So I guess I'll go to our filmmaker. Can you summarize what The Price of Peace is about for us?
Sure. So the film is an examination of deterrence in foreign policy, and we look at it in the context of various conflicts through history, from World War II to the current situation in the Korean Peninsula.
Does it focus on the Korean Peninsula?
It doesn't focus on the Korean Peninsula, but we try and bring it into a current context.
Okay. Is this through the International Affairs Forum that we're bringing the movie here, Jack?
We are happy to be married up with Tom Skinner, our local executive producer, and yes, we've been working on getting it into the state.
Why is this a timely and important film?
Oh, I guess defending our country is probably a high priority, and just as an example, there's a bill in Congress about the defense budget right now, and it'll be about $700 billion. So we are spending about $1.75 billion a day on defense, and we should probably know more about that and whether it successfully deters our adversaries.
To say a worthy thing to spend money on if you're doing it correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian Bishop, Major General, Air Force, is in the movie. You served what did you do in South Korea?
I served in South Korea on 3 separate occasions during my career. The last time is probably more pertinent to the movie, where I was Deputy Chief of Staff, United Nations Command in United States Forces Korea. So basically oversaw much of the operations that were going on in the DMZ.
And what role do you play in the movie, or what's your outlook on this movie? Why is it important for people to see as it equates to Defense Department spending or deterring?
Well, I think
keep maintaining peace.
Absolutely. I think it's important for the nation to have a conversation about what our Defense Department does. Are we able to deter war? Are we able to keep peace around the world? You can argue that one side or the other. But I think a lot of what goes on in the movie brings to light much of the questions that I believe we should be debating in an open public. And as Jack said earlier, we're spending a lot of money through the Defense Department. Probably, I would say the most money our government spends is through that one department. And it's probably good for all of us to understand where that money's going and how we can best spend it. So
are you questioning or examining strategies or like line items? Are we spending too much on this particular fighter or this much on an aircraft carrier?
No, I think the movie is much more about the policy of deterrence and does it work, and are we doing the right things by spending money on defense to try to deter?
Okay. How did you get involved in this, Elan? What was your approach to this movie to examine that?
Well, one of our key interviews is the author and historian Victor Davis Hanson, and he has done a lot of work examining deterrence and appeasement. And ultimately, he would contend that even though it is people's best intention in trying to approach things diplomatically, one cannot always find diplomatic solutions. Sometimes show of force must occur in order to stem greater conflict.
Strength through peace.
Yes.
Peace through strength, rather.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. And that is a battle that we constantly have in politics.
I think deterrence is an interesting concept, and it was developed particularly during the World War II era when we developed nuclear weapons, and then the Soviets did the same. And we had to decide how were we going to prevent these weapons from being used. Basically, deterrence is a game, in a way, between two countries that try to convince each other that they are so strong that there's no point in attacking them. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating in the movie is they take it into even places like Africa, East Africa, where tribes deter each other, sometimes through shows of force, sometimes through simply the way they approach each other physically on the savannah. And we do the same thing on a different level when we have our nuclear weapons on a submarine off the coast of a country and say something about what our intent is if we are attacked. It's all designed to prevent an attack.
It's a pretty heavy debate for the average schmo to get into, which will be a fascinating movie, I'm sure. But, to determine how much we should be spending or where we're exercising that kind of deterrence to discourage attacks on us or our interests, or if somebody wants to make the case we can do it through diplomacy or less spending.
I don't think they're separatable. Actually, they're all part of the same whole. That there is diplomacy involved. There are military maneuvers involved. Upcoming soon in Korea, South Korea, will be a U.S.-South Korean military exercise. And that is part of a deterrent strategy, to say we know how to work together, we know how to exercise and operate our two militaries together. At the same time, there are peace talks going on between North and South Korea. It's all part of a complicated negotiating strategy.
Does that, how is that all affected as you change administrations then, when you go from one president or one, namely presidential administration to the next? Mm-hmm. Does it change? Is it possible for a country to have a strategy that works from administration to administration?
Yeah, I think it does. It's Jack again, and I think the idea is that you have interests and you protect your interests and you have alliances with other countries, and those don't change very much from one administration to the next. There are, of course, changes whenever a new president comes in, and we are going through that period now. But fundamentally, we've made decisions about which countries are our allies, which share our principles, our moral standards, and those are the countries that we try to stay aligned with.
So in North Korea is getting nuclear weapons. How do we deter them from using those? I'll ask retired Major General Brian Bishop.
Well, I think it's through a lot of things. One is, as Jack talked about, I think primarily through diplomacy and trying to have open discussions with them and let them understand what our interests are and what we're trying to do. As Jack also brought up, I was part of several military exercises in Korea through my 3 tours over there, both as a young fighter pilot and then at the headquarters level when I was there on my last tour. And all of those things, I think, demonstrate to a country what we're capable of doing. Those play intertwined along with what the embassy's doing in South Korea and many of the conversations that are happening in the press right now. I think one interesting thing, though, is that deterrent policy is inherently escalatory in nature, because if you go back and look at our deterrent policy with respect to Russia, we would have developed nuclear weapons, then they would develop nuclear weapons, then we would develop a defense to it, then they would develop a defense to it. And, at the end of the day, we got to a level where we were going to develop Star Wars, and you can argue whether we could have actually done that or not, but it is an inherently escalatory policy.
The price of peace.
Right.
That's the documentary, 6 p.m. tonight, State Theater. It's free to get in. If you want to leave donations, it will go to the Academic World Quest team from Petoskey High School. Right. They're headed to the Nationals.
Yes, we have each year a wonderful competition amongst our high schools, and they send teams in. Petoskey won again this year, and they'll be headed for the Nationals in Washington, and we're going to be raising funds tonight, voluntary contributions for their trip.
Good deal. So the film is there courtesy of who then?
Go ahead.
Free to Choose Network is the producing network of the documentary. They're based out of Erie, Pennsylvania.
So Elan is one of the filmmakers in the studio with us on a microphone right now. Does the film draw a conclusion then, or is it just putting out a lot of points for people to consider?
Our hope is that people do ask questions of themselves the way they look at current events when the film is finished. It seems, for my part, I think the conclusion I came to is that deterrence and appeasement, which are sort of flip sides of a coin, it seems like they can only be called that after the fact. Deterrence seems to be deterrence when it was a show of force that was successful, and appeasement seems to only be appeasement when it's a failed diplomatic concession.
Right.
And I think that it does make me look at current decisions being made in a different way.
That was just with the film The Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill. That showed up. I just got to see that over the weekend. But about
Wonderful
Chamberlain
movie,
and Chamberlain versus Churchill, as far as the way they looked at dealing with Hitler back then. And Churchill won out. Deterrence won out.
It's a complicated aspect of life to measure.
Yeah.
Are you sufficiently deterring the other side without overspending? I mean, we have 1,550 nuclear weapons. The Chinese have 300, and they think that's enough to deter us. So these calculations are made by each country vis-a-vis the potential adversaries.
See, but once you're in the nuclear club like that, there has to be some mutual understanding that if you start it, what are you starting? If China uses a nuke on us, or Russia, or we use one on them, or the North Korea gets in the game, or India and Pakistan, it's just going to set off an all-out nuclear situation,
So
which nobody would want, right?
That's a very interesting question, because there are, I believe, once you join the nuclear club, there are many more responsibilities placed on you. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're very wary about North Korea getting nuclear weapons, because we're not exactly sure that the lessons that they have learned watching the United States, think about what happened in Libya. Libya gave away their nuclear weapons, and now Gaddafi's dead. Now, I think Kim Jong-un took away a lesson from that we would not have taken away. And so is he willing to accept the responsibility imposed upon him by having nuclear weapons in his country?
With Iran, what would you call our approach there, where we came up with this controversial not treaty, the nuclear agreement, I guess? Was that appeasement, or was that deterrent, or delaying
I think what Brian has just said is very important, that countries take lessons from what happens to those countries that have given up their nuclear weapons. There have been a few. And so the Iranians look at it and say, well, we want to be a first-class world power, therefore we want nuclear weapons. They have kind of put the pause button on of their nuclear program, but they haven't stopped it. And within 10 years, they are allowed to begin to, again, work on it. They say they don't want nuclear weapons, but it's just a statement.
What are if that is old? If nuclear is old school, though, with all that you can disrupt with technology now, I mean, suppose you could hold that over a country's head and say we can shut your electricity and power down in a heartbeat by hacking into your systems or your financial system.
Yeah, that is a big concern. But we spoke to Neil Ferguson, who spoke of nuclear weapons and a lot of the modern electronic warfare. And while they're both a threat, it seems like as nuclear weapons become cheaper and easier to acquire, it's proliferation that is of great concern, because, as he puts it, if every 2-bit dictator can have one, it's going to be a very dangerous world. So I think it's just as big a concern.
Yeah, Brian alluded to the idea of what you might call mature nuclear relationships, if there is such a thing, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, later the U.S. and Russia. Karen and I years ago worked on something called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Agreement, and we exchange information with Russia about where our nuclear weapons are, when we're going to open a silo for maintenance, so that they don't get scared, and vice versa. We don't have that kind of arrangements between India, Pakistan, and we certainly don't have it with North Korea. We have to, hopefully we will get North Korea to stop their nuclear program. I'm not terribly optimistic about that. But if not, we have to have a relationship that tells us that what they're doing with their nuclear weapons is not meant to actually start a war.
So if you get more bad actors in the game and the technology or the materials needed, cheesecake or whatever it is that they need to make this stuff, people are willing to sell it to one another, and you do get more 2-bit countries that have nukes. I mean, we're going that direction, if any direction. Then does it make sense to invest in defense systems, Star Wars or something else, or intelligence, or how do you prevent that?
Yes to all the above.
Yes to all the above.
The question is how much do you want to spend?
Right, exactly.
We've been working on preventing a missile attack, and I underscore that because Putin was on TV this past week saying, "Oh, well, we don't worry about your defenses. We have maneuverable warheads. We have warheads we can fire from submarines. We will be able to attack you." In fact, that's the deal we've always had with the Soviet Union and Russia, that we are in a mutual suicide pact with them. And that is still there. If you take that away and say we can defend ourselves, then you've changed the whole game of deterrence.
Yeah.
Now, with somebody like North Korea, that might be what we want, though. We want to say we can't trust him. We don't know enough about what he would do. And so we're going to defend ourselves. And the Congress is looking right now at building 100 launchers for mid-range missiles that would attack warheads flying over. These things aren't working that well. It's not so easy. But we are investing the money now with the idea that they'll improve their capabilities as they go along. That's part of deterrence too, though. If you have a viable, credible defensive system, that changes the equation of someone who might be thinking about attacking you.
Yeah, well, in the military, then, where you're charged with defense of you're called on to defend us and our interests. Does the military sector generally favor more spending and support the ideas of advancing? I mean, can we intercept missiles in the air now? Will Star Wars work? Is that something we should work toward?
So that is, as Jack alluded to, that is an incredibly difficult problem, and there are many ways to try to tackle that. Do you tackle it on the leading edge of the launch, or do you try to tackle that on the trailing edge when you have multiple warheads coming in? And both ways are very, very difficult challenges. From the military standpoint, we want to be able to provide the president options and the nation capabilities when asked to do so. Those options require a certain amount of spending. And that's why I think this film is really important for everyone to see, because we need to have the nation as part of that conversation.
The Price of Peace is the film. We'll take a quick break. We'll get back and talk to the filmmakers more about how they produce this and what's in it. It's a free movie tonight at 6 o'clock at the State Theater in Traverse City. You should reserve your tickets ahead of time as opposed to showing up at the door at 5 minutes before 6. So you can call. I would suggest getting to the box office if you can. It's free, but if you want to leave a donation, it will benefit the Petoskey High School Academic World Quest team, which goes to Washington, D.C. for the Nationals next month. We'll be right back with our panel and talk more about with the movie makers next for The Price of Peace on WTCM.
The National Cherry Festival welcomes American music icon and 9-time Grammy Award recipient Sheryl Crow to the Pepsi Bayside Music Stage.
1905. All right, joining us in the studio today to talk about the film The Price of Peace, which was produced. There's a lot of local ties here. Tom Skinner, who has a long career of producing documentaries and things for PBS, is the executive producer. The filmmakers are in here. Elan Bentov and Kip Perry are in. And then retired Major General Brian Bishop of the Air Force lives in Leelanau County. He's actually in the film and with us now talking about it as well. It airs tonight, 6 o'clock, State Theater. It's free, but just make your reservations to get there. And it examines the price of peace, what it cost us, specifically in the United States, I assume, is what you're looking at. Yes. What it costs for us to maintain peace, and what are the options that we're looking at. Well, welcome to the conversation, Kip Perry. Tell us a bit about making the movie. I mean, how difficult is it? What's the challenge in making a movie like this that has to have you have to spend time to kind of inform people of what the issues are, You have to have some data and information in there. You have to find credible interview subjects. I mean, how do you put all that together to make an interesting movie?
I think it begins with an idea, and the idea really sprung from Victor Davis Hanson and a lot of his writings. He's a Hoover Institution fellow, senior fellow there, and he wrote a lot about deterrence and appeasement, or deterrence versus appeasement, and so that was really the genesis of this project. And this is not a film that is going to dig into Defense Department spending or try to point out $800 hammers and things like that. No. This is really just looking at a variety of case studies, shall we say, if we call them that, throughout history.
What are some of the case studies then that you've detailed here, Elan?
Well, we begin the piece in East Africa. We wanted to explore the idea of deterrence as reputation, as it's influenced by reputation and credibility. Without taking into account modern day geopolitical contexts. But we go into World War II and the lead up to that, the Munich Agreement, the Falkland War, which is often forgotten or unknown in the United States. The current situation in the Korean Peninsula, mutually assured destruction, the nuclear issues that surrounded the Cold War, and then we even touch on the how does one deter terror today? Non-state actors.
That's a real challenge with non-state actors. How do
we do it all in 60 minutes?
In 60 minutes. By the way, you'll be there tonight. Will there be Q&A afterwards?
Yes. With
everybody involved here. There'll be questions and answers after the movie tonight. So get an early dinner and get to the theater by 6, film over by 7-ish, and time for Q&A. What's keeping the peace on the Korean Peninsula now? Because they have the line, but how do they keep those countries at peace for 50 years, 60 years?
It's a very complex situation, which Brian is probably the most qualified to speak to. But one thing I think is important to remember is the Korean War didn't end. It was there's only an armistice agreement in place. So technically, North and South are still at war. And I think people forget about that until you go to the DMZ and you stand in the room where the armistice table is, and you see, does it really kind of wash over you this whole idea that, wow, well, war could just resume. Not break out again, but just resume.
Did you travel to the Korean Peninsula?
Yes.
Yeah. So Brian, retired Major General Brian Bishop, Air Force, was 3 times stationed there, and command of some kind too?
Yes, wing commander down at Kunsan Air Base.
So are you right on the line there?
Kunsan is actually, about 2/3 the way down on the west coast. There's 2 major Air Force bases, and then there's several Army bases, some larger, some smaller. And then we do have some U.S. forces stationed in Panmunjom area, which is the joint security area, essentially the blue buildings that everyone sees on the news when we refer to the DMZ.
Is the U.S. presence there the deterrent that prevents North Korea, say, from being the aggressor?
It is one deterrent. It is one of many complicated pieces of the deterrence there. I think that the South Korean military is very capable. I believe that they could handle the defense of their peninsula on their own, but by not having the 28,500 U.S. forces there in the peninsula, it would send a very different signal to North Korea. And I believe that having U.S. forces there sends a very strong signal, and it sends, if nothing else, it sends a signal about our willingness and our commitment to help the South Korean people defend their nation.
So have we increased that presence with the threat of nuclear weapons with North Korea?
No, we have not increased it. Over the last 60-plus years, we have only drawn down the number of forces that we have in the Korean Peninsula. But I do believe that the 28,500 or so that are there under treaty right now is about the right number. We shouldn't be going much below that.
Okay. How many did you say? 500?
28,500.
28,500. Okay.
I think an interesting, just to paint a little picture here, the DMZ is about 45 minutes from Seoul, which is an enormous economy and a lot of people in Seoul. And along that border are all sorts of weapons that North Korea has pointed at South Korea. And so imagine just having to drive 45 minutes away in any direction here, and having that much firepower aimed at you. The South Koreans don't seem to be too upset about it. They just go on with life as we know it. But it's a very real and present threat.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. When I'm sure that Kip and Elan, when they went out there and saw it, just driving out of Seoul, not too far. I mean, you get no more than 5 or 10 miles north of the center of Seoul, and you start to see South Korean defensive emplacements. You see tank emplacements. You see these things that are placed out in the Han River to keep frogmen from swimming up the Han River and to keep submarines from coming up the Han River. It's a very real deterrent and a very real prospect for the South Koreans.
So both sides have have their forces, their power built up there at the DMZ.
Absolutely.
And actually, one of the things that Brian spoke of when we interviewed him a year ago now, when we first went on this journey, is one thing that I thought was very impressive and people don't consider is that the U.S.'s presence there actually keeps deters the North from, hitting on the South, but it also keeps the South from attacking the North.
Yeah. So if the North Korea is unlikely to attack the South because of the U.S. presence there, plus the South Korean military, doesn't it make sense then they wouldn't want to, or does it follow then if they have nukes that they wouldn't use those because they know there'd be retaliation there too?
So I believe that Kim Jong-un's sole strategic goal is to keep himself and his family in power. And when you put it in that context, he will use nuclear weapons if he thinks that is the last thing that will keep him in power. That doesn't mean I don't believe he's getting ready to launch a missile at the United States with a nuclear tip on it and do something to New York or Washington, D.C. That doesn't make any sense. But if he was pressured in a way that he felt that his power was going to be removed or his family would be removed from power, then he might consider it. And now that having nuclear weapons is something that we need to think as part of the entire diplomacy calculus.
So understanding your enemy, that's his sole goal, is to stay in power.
Right.
And he'll make decisions based on that.
Right. And, he hasn't shown that he cares about the people in North Korea.
No.
There is an elite ruling class. Yes, he will take care of them, but they're not taking care of the average North Korean citizen. What
about, so we're spending a lot to essentially protect South Korea or to maintain peace on the peninsula. And we do that through military. We do that through diplomacy. We spend a lot of money. What about intelligence or... I guess that we have laws against assassination, but would it make any sense to try to take him out of power, to try to put in a reasonable leader that you could negotiate with?
I would argue that our nation has done that on several occasions, and we haven't been very successful at that in other places around the world. So who are you going to put in power? What are you going to do? What's the power vacuum that's going to happen if you do eliminate Kim Jong-un? There are so many questions, and it doesn't just apply to the Korean Peninsula. I mean, it applies to every conflict that we have ever been in.
Yeah. So our reality, we would think, those people would be so thankful that the U.S. came in and got rid of this guy. We're going to whip a little democracy on them, or at least some good food. But they might not see it like that.
They won't see it like that because the North Korean people absolutely believe that the United States is there to destroy North Korea.
Yeah, amazing. All right, we have to get a quick break. We'll be right back and talk more. Again, The Price of Peace is the movie. Should be fascinating. 60 minutes tonight. And that was made by our Elan Bentov and Kip Perry are in the studio with us. And Tom Skinner is the executive producer out of Leelanau County. Brian Bishop is in the movie, retired Major General from the Air Force. And Jack Siegel's in, too, with the International Affairs Forum, helping to bring this to Traverse City. Quick break, a reminder, get your reservations today so that you can get to the movie at 6 o'clock tonight. It's free, but you should get a reservation or get advance tickets. Quick break, 42. All right, in the studio with us now, we have filmmakers Elan Bentov. We have Kip Perry, and this movie is The Price of Peace. The executive producer, Tom Skinner, joins us right now. Welcome aboard, Tom.
Thank you, Ron.
So you have, tell us a little bit about your background. You're in Leelanau County and you've done this movie here, but what other projects have you worked on?
I've been in this business for 50 years. For 26 of them, I executive produced all of the National Geographic programs for public television, all the programs that were done with the National Academy of Sciences. the Planet Earth series, the very first one, which won the Emmy for Best Informational Series. So I've lived in documentary film for the last 50 years, and I'm currently senior executive producer of the Free to Choose Network. We do about 3 programs for public television every year. We're currently at work now on a program in finished shooting in Sweden called Ask If Sweden Has Lessons for America. And we're doing 3 hours on the American Constitution called Constitution at Risk.
Wow.
And I'm delighted to have met up with these 2 guys who did American Retreat last year, and this year have done this film. I'd underscore that it's an entertaining film to look at because of the stories and the twists and turns that they've brought to the story. The Falkland War is there because it was one of those classic mistakes. The British happened to withdraw a ship, and the Argentines thought, oh, they don't really care about defending this place, so bang, we had a war, and a lot of people were killed as a result of a miscalculation. Yeah. Brian was very influential in getting Kip and Elan into North Korea, to the DMZ. They probably wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for him. And they uncovered a story that probably your listeners don't know anything about, which was the great axe murder that occurred when American troops were killed in North Korea back in the 50s? 70s? And how America responded with force and how the North Koreans backed down. Another fascinating story, Kip had arranged to do an interview with the man who the BBC describes as the man who saved the world. And this was the guy in charge with his hand on the button in the Soviet Union to respond to a nuclear attack. And he saw missiles coming, and I won't give away the rest of the story. The very last minute, Kip got a call from this man's son saying he's very sorry to report his father has just died, but he would be happy to do the interview if Kip could get to Moscow. Well, Kip and Elan got to Moscow, did the story. So there are stories of human beings in the context of all of the public affairs things that these people have been talking about this morning, which make this a really interesting film to look at.
That's what makes it a movie, is stories like that.
That makes
human
it a movie. It's the story.
Executive producer, so the role you play is you choose the filmmaker. The project is an idea, and then we need filmmakers to do it.
Right.
We need a budget. We
Right.
need to know if they can go to Moscow. That's you that makes all of
Basically,
those.
I work with them, supervise these things. I'm a sounding board, kind of guide, philosopher, and friend to make the movie, and making sure that the film delivers what we expect it to deliver. It'll be on public television here in Michigan in April, a good prime time at 9 o'clock on April 6th. And this is a chance to look at it on the big, beautiful screen at the State Theater. These guys have been looking at this film on a computer for the last year, right? and it's quite an experience to see it on that screen.
Yeah, especially with a few hundred people in the audience there. Absolutely. So last year you did the same idea. It was a free movie, and it was to raise money for the World Quest academic teams traveling to Washington, our local teams. This year, same guys, different movie.
Yep.
And by the way, it sounds like, too, a lot of the examples, too, are about deterrence. I mean, is there much on diplomacy at all? Did you make a point where diplomacy has been used to keep peace?
We really tell that whole story of the Munich Agreement, and you alluded to the Churchill story and so on. We tell that whole story. And a young military woman from Hoover has a very interesting perspective on that, which is not the perspective that you would expect she would have. But it puts that whole move of what Chamberlain was trying to accomplish through appeasement. But what is the famous line that Churchill has that, it's hard to appease the tiger when your head is in its mouth. Right?
Yeah, exactly, yes. All right, 9:53 is our time here. We have to get our break before the news, but I thank all of you guys for being in here today. Terrific conversation and information. Jack Siegel from the International Affairs Forum. Also, what are you, a coach, or what do we say? What's your World Quest connection? Supporter.
We are the organization that runs the Academic World Quest each year with great volunteers that help us do it.
All right, and that is great for our Northern Michigan students. Jack will be back, I'm sure, in a week or two, and we have another speaker with the International Affairs Forum. Retired Major General retired. Are you supposed to say it in that order? Major General retired?
It doesn't really matter.
Doesn't matter.
A retired general is called Mr.
Mister. All right. Brian Bishop, who did 3 stints in South Korea during his time with the military, lives in Leelanau County now, former Thunderbird pilot as well, and is featured in the movie. And then we have, we're just speaking with Tom Skinner from Leelanau County. Great quality coming out of Leelanau County, of course. Executive producer of The Price of Peace. And our filmmakers are here in the studio. We'll be at the theater tonight to see it on the big screen and answer questions and discuss that. Kip Perry, thanks for being in. Appreciate your time. And Elan Bentov, thank you so much for your time, too.
Thank you.
Quick break, and we'll be back on WTCM Newstalk 580.